February 20th, 1943. Just after dawn, in the cold rain of a Tunisian winter, a column of Italian bersaglieri soldiers, their distinctive plumed helmets soaked and heavy, charged up the rocky slope of Jebel Chambi. Their commander, Colonel Luigi Bonfatti of the Centauro Armored Division, ran at the front of his men, pistol drawn, shouting them forward into American machine gun fire. Behind him, German panzers of the 10th Panzer Division ground through the narrow gap of Kasserine Pass, crushing abandoned equipment beneath their treads. Explosions echoed off the canyon walls. Smoke drifted across a landscape littered with burning vehicles, scattered ammunition, and the bodies of young American soldiers who had never seen combat before that week. The pass had broken. The United States Army was in full retreat, and the men running from this fight were experiencing the worst American military defeat since the Civil War. In the days that followed, Axis commanders, German and Italian alike, would write off the Americans as amateurs, soldiers who could not fight. An army that lacked the will and the skill to stand against battle-hardened European troops. They had no idea how wrong they would be. Because in just 39 days, the same American army would come back and hand them a defeat so sharp, so decisive, that it would change the entire course of the war in North Africa. And the Italian and German commanders who had dismissed those retreating soldiers would be left trying to understand how it had happened so fast. This is the story of the most dramatic military transformation of the Second World War. To understand what happened at Kasserine Pass, you first need to understand Tunisia in early 1943 and why green American troops found themselves fighting veteran German and Italian forces in the deserts and mountains of North Africa. The war in North Africa had been raging for nearly 3 years. It began in 1940 when Mussolini's Italy invaded Egypt from Libya, only to be crushed by a far smaller British force. Hitler sent Rommel and the Afrika Korps to rescue his Italian allies, and for the next 2 years the Desert War seesawed back and forth across Libya and western Egypt. Finally, in October 1942, British forces under General Bernard Montgomery defeated Rommel decisively at El Alamein, driving the Afrika Korps westward in a long retreat across Libya toward Tunisia. Meanwhile, in November 1942, American and British forces had landed in Morocco and Algeria during Operation Torch, the first major Anglo-American amphibious operation of the war. For most of the American soldiers who waded ashore on those North African beaches, it was their first time under fire. Many had been civilians just months earlier, drafted or enlisted after Pearl Harbor, rushed through training, and shipped across the Atlantic with no combat experience whatsoever. They had fought briefly against the Vichy French forces in Morocco and Algeria, but that was a short, confused action against an enemy that did not particularly want to fight. It was nothing like what was waiting for them in Tunisia. The Allied plan was simple in concept. Montgomery would push from the east. The Torch forces would push from the west. The Axis armies would be crushed between them in Tunisia. But the Germans moved faster than anyone expected. Hitler ordered reinforcements poured into Tunisia from Sicily, ferrying troops and tanks across the narrow strait. By January 1943, there were 2 Axis armies in Tunisia. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim commanded the 5th Panzer Army in the north, and the forces facing Montgomery in the south had been reorganized into the 1st Italian Army, under General Giovanni Messe, a veteran commander who had fought in Russia and Ethiopia. This was notable because Messe became the first Italian general given operational command over German units, including elements of the famous Afrika Korps. Holding the southern sector of the Allied line was the American Second Corps under Major General Lloyd Fredendall, and this is where the problems began. Fredendall had come highly recommended. General George Marshall himself had called him one of the best. But in Tunisia, everything about his command was wrong. He established his headquarters at a place called Speedy Valley, nearly 70 miles behind the front lines. There, he ordered the 19th Combat Engineer Regiment, men who should have been building fortifications at the front, to instead spend 3 weeks drilling a massive underground bunker complex, 160 feet deep into solid rock. This was his personal command post. When General Dwight Eisenhower visited, he was appalled. He would later tell associates that generals were expendable, just like any other item in an army, a pointed rebuke of Fredendall's obsession with his own safety. Brigadier General Omar Bradley called it an embarrassment to every American soldier. But the bunker was only the most visible symptom of a deeper rot. The real problem was tactical, and it extended from the command post all the way down to the front lines. Fredendall had scattered his forces across the Tunisian landscape in small, isolated packets. He broke up the 1st Armoured Division under Major General Orlando Ward into tiny combat groups and spread them across dozens of miles, ignoring Ward's repeated and increasingly desperate objections. Infantry battalions were placed on hilltops, without mutual support, without adequate anti-tank weapons, and without clear lines of retreat. Units that should have been fighting together were separated by miles of open desert. Communication between them was poor. Coordination was worse. Fredendall also had a peculiar habit of issuing orders in a personal code that his own staff could barely understand. He would refer to units by nicknames and oblique references, rather than standard military designations, creating confusion up and down the chain of command at precisely the moment when clarity was essential. He rarely visited the front lines. He distrusted several of his subordinate commanders, particularly Ward, and frequently bypassed them to issue orders directly to their subordinates, further undermining unit cohesion and the chain of command. It was a textbook example of how not to lead an army in combat. Rommel, who always had an eye for weakness, saw the opportunity immediately. On February 14, 1943, the blow fell. It was a cold, overcast morning. At 4 o'clock, 140 German tanks in 4 battle groups struck through Faid and Maizila passes in a coordinated pincer attack that Eisenhower himself had inspected just hours before. The 10th Panzer Division attacked from Faid. The 21st Panzer Division drove through Maizila. They hit the American positions at Sidi Bouzid like a hammer hitting glass. The German soldiers in those tanks and half-tracks were veterans. Many had fought across North Africa for 2 years. They knew how to maneuver in the desert, how to use terrain, how to coordinate tanks with infantry and anti-tank guns. The Americans they were attacking had been in North Africa for barely 3 months. Most had never been in a tank battle. Some had never fired their weapons at a living enemy. The Americans at Sidi Bouzid were Combat Command A of the 1st Armoured Division and the 168th Regimental Combat Team of the 34th Infantry Division under Colonel Thomas Drake. They were isolated on hilltops called Jebel Lesouda, Jebel Ksaira, and Garet Hadid, exactly where Fredendall had placed them over Ward's express objections. The German panzers swept past them, cutting them off from each other and from any possibility of retreat. By 5 in the afternoon on that first day, Combat Command A had lost 44 tanks. The next day, February 15th, Fredendall ordered a counterattack. 51 M4 Sherman tanks of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Armoured Regiment, under Lieutenant Colonel James Alger, rolled forward into the desert toward Sidi Bouzid. They drove straight into an ambush. German 88mm anti-tank guns, the most feared weapon in the North African desert, opened fire from concealed positions. 44 of the 51 Shermans were destroyed. Alger was captured. The counterattack was annihilated. Colonel Drake's 168th Infantry, still surrounded on the hilltops, sent a desperate message scrawled on a scrap of paper. Surrounded. Reinforcements urgent. But Fredendall refused Drake's request to withdraw. The regiment was overrun. Drake and most of his men were captured. In just 2 days at Sidi Bouzid, the Americans had lost over 2,500 men, 103 tanks, 280 vehicles, and 18 field guns. And the worst was still to come. Rommel now proposed a bold stroke. He wanted to drive through Kasserine Pass and seize the massive Allied supply base at Tebessa, which would have been a catastrophic blow to the entire Allied position in North Africa. But the Italian High Command in Rome, the Comando Supremo, overruled him. Instead of concentrating his forces on Tebessa, they ordered Rommel to split his attack through both Kasserine and Spiba passes simultaneously. It was a compromise that weakened both thrusts, but even the diluted attack was devastating. The pass itself was a 2-mile-wide gap in the Grand Dorsal Mountains, a natural gateway through the rugged terrain of central Tunisia. It was defended by a hastily assembled force under Colonel Alexander Stark Jr., designated Stark Force. His command included elements of the 26th Infantry Regiment, the 19th Combat Engineer Regiment, those same engineers who had just been pulled off building Fredendall's bunker, the 33rd Field Artillery Battalion, the 805th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and French Colonial Artillery. Many of these men had never fired a weapon in combat. The engineers had been trained to build, not to fight as infantry. They were given rifles and told to hold the line. On the morning of February 19th, the first German probes came through the pass. Reconnaissance units of the Afrika Korps assault group tested the American defenses. The American artillery and tank destroyers held them off through the day, but Rommel was just feeling out the position. The real assault would come the next morning. On February 20th, in cold rain, Rommel committed everything. German tanks and infantry pushed up the valley floor while artillery pounded the American positions. And the Italian bersaglieri of the Centauro Division were ordered to assault the heights flanking the pass. Colonel Bonfatti led the charge personally. His bersaglieri, elite light infantry recognized by the distinctive black capercaillie feathers on their helmets, scrambled up the rocky slopes under withering fire. These were not the poorly motivated Italian conscripts that Allied propaganda liked to portray. The bersaglieri were among Italy's finest soldiers, proud of a tradition dating back to 1836, trained to move fast and hit hard. Bonfatti was killed leading the attack, cut down at the front of his men. General Karl Buloius of the Afrika Korps assault group later cited the bersaglieri's action as the instrumental event of the Axis breakthrough. Bonfatti's men broke through the American flank. The line cracked. The 19th Combat Engineers and the 33rd Field Artillery Battalion were overrun. Italian armor from the Centauro pushed up the highway. The pass was open. For the next 2 days, Rommel's forces pushed deeper. The 10th Panzer Division drove toward Thala. The Afrika Korps assault group with Italian tanks from the Centauro pushed toward Tebessa. British armoured units were thrown in to stop the advance, and they took terrible losses. Gorforce, a British armoured column, lost all 11 of its tanks in a desperate rearguard action. But then the tide began to slow. British and American artillery, reinforced by the artillery battalions of the 9th Infantry Division that had made a nearly 800-mile forced march from western Algeria in under 4 days, opened concentrated fire on the German and Italian formations. Rommel, overextended, low on fuel, and aware that Montgomery's 8th Army was approaching his rear at the Mareth line, made the decision to withdraw. Before dawn on February 23rd, the Axis forces pulled back through the pass. By February 25th, Allied forces reoccupied Kasserine Pass. The battle was over. The cost was staggering. American Second Corps had lost approximately 6,500 men, 183 tanks, 208 artillery pieces, over 500 vehicles. Rommel's own report claimed more than 4,000 Allied prisoners. The Axis forces had pushed the Americans back over 50 miles in less than a week, a greater retreat than the Allies would suffer even during the Battle of the Bulge 2 years later. It was the worst defeat inflicted on American forces in the European and North African theatres during the entire war. The shock rippled far beyond Tunisia. Back in Washington, there was genuine alarm that the American army might not be capable of fighting the Germans on equal terms. British commanders, who had already harboured doubts about American combat capability, felt their worst suspicions confirmed. General Alexander, the new Army Group commander, privately considered relegating American forces to secondary roles for the rest of the campaign. Among the Axis commanders on the ground, the reaction was a mixture of satisfaction and open contempt. General von Arnim, who had fought the Americans at Sidi Bou Zid, concluded that a simple spoiling attack would always be enough to scatter American forces. He saw no reason to take them seriously as opponents. Rommel himself was more nuanced but still dismissive. He believed the Americans lacked combat experience and that their leadership was fundamentally weak. He noted in particular their failure to coordinate infantry with armor and their tendency to fight in small, isolated groups, rather than concentrating their considerable material advantages. Italian commanders, including officers of the Centauro Division who had watched American positions collapse under pressure, formed similar conclusions. The consensus among the Italian officer corps was straightforward. The Americans had numbers and equipment, but they did not know how to use them. They simply could not fight. What none of them anticipated was what happened next. Because the very qualities that the Axis commanders mocked, the American belief in accountability, the willingness to confront failure openly, the insistence that results mattered more than seniority, were about to transform the army they had just defeated. The process began at the top. In the days after Kasserine, Eisenhower faced one of the most difficult decisions of his career. Fredendall had been personally selected by Marshall, the most powerful officer in the American military. Relieving him would be an implicit admission that the American High Command had placed the wrong man in charge at a critical moment. It would raise questions about judgment at the highest levels. But Eisenhower had learned something from the disaster, something that would define his leadership for the rest of the war. He cared more about winning than about protecting reputations, including his own. On March 5, 1943, Eisenhower flew to Tebessa. He pulled aside Omar Bradley, whom he had sent to Second Corps as his personal observer just days earlier. Eisenhower asked a simple question. "What do you think of the command here?" Bradley's answer was blunt. "It is pretty bad. I have talked to all the division commanders. To a man they have lost confidence in Fredendall as the corps commander." Major General Ernest Harmon of the 2nd Armored Division, who had been rushed to Kasserine to help stabilize the situation, had already told Eisenhower privately that Fredendall was a moral and physical coward. Sir Harold Alexander, the British general who had just taken over the new 18th Army Group, told Eisenhower he would welcome a replacement. The decision was made. Fredendall was out. On March 6, 1943, at 10 in the morning, Lieutenant General George Patton Jr. arrived at 2nd Corps headquarters. He found Fredendall still eating breakfast. The changeover was immediate. Patton had been pulled from planning the invasion of Sicily. He had been given temporary command of 2nd Corps with one mission: fix it. He had exactly 11 days before the next offensive. What Patton found appalled him. On March 13th, he wrote in his diary, "I cannot see what Fredendall did to justify his existence. Have never seen so little order or discipline." Officers were not wearing helmets. Saluting had become optional. Soldiers were slovenly and demoralized. The army that had been humiliated at Kasserine Pass looked like it felt humiliated. Patton attacked the problem with a fury that became legendary. His first order closed the mess hall at 7:30 in the morning. If you were not there on time, you did not eat. Then came the uniform regulations. Every soldier would wear a helmet with the chin strap fastened at all times. Officers would wear neckties. All ranks would wear leggings. Violations carried a $25 fine, roughly half a private's monthly pay. The troops called it the $25 derby. Patton fined nurses in hospital wards for not wearing helmets. He fined men caught without helmets in latrines. No exceptions. It seemed petty. Many soldiers resented it at first. But Bradley, who served as Patton's deputy, understood exactly what was happening. He later wrote that each time a soldier knotted his necktie, threaded his leggings, and buckled on his heavy steel helmet, he was forcibly reminded that Patton had come to command the 2nd Corps, that the easygoing days were over. The uniform regulations were not about neckties, they were about obedience. If men would not follow orders in small things, Patton reasoned, they could not be trusted to follow orders when their lives depended on it. He believed that discipline in the details was what separated an army that fought from one that fell apart under pressure. But discipline was only the visible surface of the transformation. Beneath it, Patton was rebuilding the army's tactical foundations from the ground up. He reversed Fredendall's disastrous policy of scattering units across the landscape. Large formations would fight concentrated, with infantry, armor, artillery, and tank destroyers working together as combined arms teams. He attached tank destroyer battalions directly to infantry divisions so they could train together and fight together. He integrated British 6-pounder anti-tank guns into American positions, replacing the inadequate 37mm guns that had proven useless against German armor at Kasserine. 31 new M10 tank destroyers, with their powerful 3-inch guns, arrived with the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion, giving the Americans their first vehicle capable of reliably destroying German panzers at combat range. He assessed his division commanders with brutal honesty. Of the 4 divisions in 2nd Corps, Patton considered only Terry Allen's 1st Infantry Division ready for battle. He judged Ward's 1st Armored Division too timid after the mauling at Kasserine. He found Major General Charles Ryder's 34th Infantry Division too defensive-minded. And he reserved judgment on Major General Manton Eddy's 9th Infantry Division, which had not yet seen serious combat, calling their readiness the valor of ignorance. Patton brought in 75 experienced officers and 175 enlisted veterans from the 2nd Armoured and 3rd Infantry Divisions to seed combat knowledge throughout 2nd Corps. British 8th Army liaison officers were attached to American units. air support coordination was overhauled. Artillery fire control was centralized so that every gun in a division could be brought to bear on a single target within minutes. And Patton led from the front. He was everywhere, visiting command posts, inspecting positions, driving into areas under fire. During a visit to Major General Terry Allen's command post near Sened on March 21st, Patton and Allen were caught by an artillery barrage. They dove into a foxhole together as shells exploded around them. The rounds landed exactly where Patton had been standing moments before. On March 17th, 2nd Corps began its offensive. 88,000 men were moving forward. The first objective was the town of Gafsa, which the Italian Centauro Division had been holding. But when Allen's 1st Infantry Division advanced on the town, the Italians withdrew without a fight, pulling back to stronger positions to the east. Patton had his first victory, though he knew it was hollow. He wanted a real fight. The real test was coming. The next day, Lieutenant Colonel William Darby's 1st Ranger Battalion seized the town of El Guettar. Darby was a remarkable officer, just 28 years old, who had modelled his Rangers on the British commandos. His men were volunteers, chosen for physical toughness and aggressiveness, and they had already built a fearsome reputation in the torch landings. On the night of March 20th, Darby's Rangers performed one of the most audacious small unit actions of the entire North African campaign. They scaled a sheer cliff face in total darkness, climbing hand over hand up rocks that would have been difficult to manage in daylight, and surprised Italian defenders on a flanking ridge at the top. The Italians, who had considered the cliff impassable, were overwhelmed. The Rangers took hundreds of prisoners. Over the following 2 days, Allen's 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red One, drove Italian forces of the Centauro from the ridges northeast and southeast of El Guettar, capturing hundreds more. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the senior German commander in the Mediterranean, was alarmed. The Centauro Division's positions were collapsing. He ordered the 10th Panzer Division, von Arnim's only mobile reserve, to counterattack and drive the Americans back. Von Arnim shared Rommel's low opinion of American fighting ability. He believed a single armoured thrust would be enough to scatter them again, just as it had at Sidi Bouzid 5 weeks earlier. He was catastrophically wrong. March 23rd, 1943. The morning broke cold and grey over the El Guettar Valley. At 5 in the morning, American soldiers of the 18th Infantry Regiment captured a German motorcycle scout. Under interrogation, the prisoner revealed that a major armoured attack was imminent. Word spread through the American lines. Gun crews checked their weapons. Infantry dug deeper into their foxholes. Tank destroyer crews loaded their first rounds. At 6 in the morning, approximately 50 tanks of the 10th Panzer Division emerged from the pass into the El Guettar Valley. Behind them came Panzer Grenadiers in half-tracks, motorcycle infantry, and soldiers of the 7th Bersaglieri Regiment in trucks and carriers. It was a formidable force, the same veteran division that had helped shatter the Americans at Kasserine just 30 days earlier. Their commander, Lieutenant General Friedrich von Breusch, expected to sweep the Americans from the valley in a matter of hours. After all, that was exactly what had happened at Sidi Bouzid. They expected another rout. What they got was a wall of fire. The German tanks and Italian infantry drove forward aggressively, breaking through the gap between the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 18th Infantry Regiment. The 1st Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Robert York bore the brunt. The German tanks pushed deep into the American positions, overrunning elements of the 32nd and 5th Field Artillery Battalions. American artillerymen fought with small arms before being forced to spike their guns to prevent capture. The 7th Bersaglieri captured approximately 170 American soldiers from York's battalion. Radio Rome would later broadcast a triumphant announcement of the capture. German tanks reached to within 6 miles of the regimental rear. 2 panzers came within direct sight of Major General Allen's own command post. For a moment, it looked like Kasserine all over again. The Germans had punched through the American line. Units were being overrun. Prisoners were being taken. Any other army in that position, with the memory of a crushing defeat barely a month old, might have broken. Allen refused to move. When staff officers suggested displacing the command post to a safer location, Allen's response entered the history books. "I will like hell pull out, and I will shoot the first man who does." Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the son of the 26th President, serving as Allen's assistant division commander, moved forward to a frontline observation post under German bombing and strafing. At 55 years old, walking with a cane due to injuries from the First World War, Roosevelt stood in the open rallying troops and directing fire. He would later receive a decoration for his conduct that day. And then the German advance hit the American trap. The panzers rolled into a minefield that had been laid the previous evening. 8 tanks were disabled immediately, their tracks blown apart, their crews scrambling to escape. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, armed with 31 M375mm gun motor carriages, and the 7 M10s of the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion opened fire at 1,500 yards. Massed divisional artillery, now centralized under a single fire direction center, exactly as Patton had ordered, poured shells into the German formations. It was a killing ground. The combined arms defense that Patton had rebuilt in 11 days worked exactly as designed. Infantry held the line. Mines channeled the tanks. Tank destroyers engaged from hull-down positions. Artillery delivered concentrated, devastating barrages. The German tanks, which had expected to scatter a demoralized rabble, were being systematically destroyed. By 9 in the morning, 30 tanks of the 10th Panzer Division had been knocked out. The remaining panzers retreated, towing damaged vehicles behind them. The valley floor was littered with burning German armor and wrecked Italian vehicles. At 4:45 that afternoon, the Germans tried again. This time they sent infantry forward first with tanks behind, hoping to avoid the mines. But the Americans were ready. Pre-registered artillery fire, using airburst shells that exploded above the advancing troops, tore into the German infantry. 340 Allied air sorties flew over the valley that day, bombing and strafing Axis formations. The second attack broke apart after 2 hours. The 10th Panzer Division withdrew for good. By the end of the day, the division had lost approximately 30 tanks to all causes. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, despite losing most of its gun motor carriages in the fighting, was credited with destroying 37 enemy tanks. American artillery and mines accounted for the rest. It was the first time in the war that American forces had decisively defeated a German armored division in battle. The same army that had been routed at Kasserine Pass had stood its ground and destroyed the attack of the same caliber of forces that had broken them 5 weeks earlier. The fighting around El Guettar continued for another 2 weeks, and it was anything but easy. On the hills above the valley, American infantry of the 1st and 9th Divisions fought brutal close-quarters battles for Hill 369, known as Jebel el Karua, and Hill 772, called Jebel Burda. The terrain was savage, rocky ridges, steep slopes, and narrow gullies where men fought with grenades, bayonets, and rifle butts at distances measured in yards rather than miles. The Italians and Germans defending these positions were experienced mountain fighters, and they made the Americans pay for every meter of ground. On March 30th, an Italian counterattack from the Centauro Division recaptured ground from the 47th Infantry Regiment under Colonel Edwin Randall, and approximately 175 Americans from the 2nd Battalion were forced to surrender in confused night fighting. The next day, a combined American attack regained some ground and took several hundred prisoners, but a second Italian counterattack drove them right back to their starting positions with the loss of 9 tanks and 2 tank destroyers. The combat was savage, exhausting, and the casualties were real on both sides. General Messe called in reinforcements from the German 21st Panzer Division to hold the line. The Americans were not winning easily, but they were winning, and more importantly, they were not breaking. Units that took losses reorganized and attacked again. Soldiers who had watched friends die dug in and held their positions. The fragile confidence that had shattered at Kasserine was hardening into something durable. On April 7th, after the British 8th Army broke through the Axis line at the Battle of Wadi Akarit, American armored forces under Task Force Benson pushed down the El Guettar to Gabes Road and linked up with 8th Army patrols at 5 in the afternoon. The southern Tunisia front was sealed. The Axis reaction to the American transformation was documented by multiple commanders. Field Marshal Rommel, who had left Tunisia for Germany on March 9th and never returned, wrote in his post-war papers, "In Tunisia, the Americans had to pay a stiff price for their experience, but it brought rich dividends. Even at that time, the American generals showed themselves to be very advanced in the tactical handling of their forces. The Americans, it is fair to say, profited far more than the British from their experience in Africa, thus confirming the axiom that education is easier than re-education. Kesselring's report to the German High Command after March 23rd acknowledged the substantial loss of tanks from the 10th Panzer Division and credited the defeat to superior Allied forces and disciplined artillery. He did not use the word surprise, but the implication was clear. The Americans he was facing at El Guettar were not the Americans he had watched collapse at Kasserine. General Mess, the Italian commander, addressed the situation in his post-war memoir. He framed the American improvement as part of a broader pattern of overwhelming Allied material superiority that Italy could never match. But beneath the strategic analysis, the operational reality was unmistakable. The Americans had adapted faster than any Axis commander had thought possible. A captured German prisoner at El Guettar told American officers that the battle had been the first time his unit had ever been stopped by mere artillery and infantry. For soldiers who had swept through Poland, France, the Balkans, and North Africa, the idea that a force they had routed just weeks earlier could now stand and destroy their attack was genuinely difficult to process. The transformation was not just about one man's force of personality, it was institutional. The United States Army had built into its culture something that few armies in history have possessed: the ability to analyze failure honestly, assign accountability without regard to rank or reputation, and implement corrective action at a speed that astonished friends and enemies alike. Fredendall was relieved not because he lost a battle. Generals lose battles. He was relieved because Eisenhower recognized that the command culture he had created, the dispersed deployments, the distant headquarters, the undermining of subordinates, the failure to enforce standards, made defeat not just possible but inevitable. The reforms Patton imposed were not revolutionary innovations pulled from thin air. Combined arms doctrine, concentrated formations, centralized artillery, fire control, integrated tank-destroyer defense. All of these concepts had existed in American field manuals before the war. The failure at Kasserine was not a failure of military knowledge. It was a failure of military leadership to apply that knowledge under the pressure of actual combat. And it was fixed by replacing the leader, not the doctrine. This pattern of rapid institutional learning set the Americans apart from every other army in the Second World War. Other armies recovered from defeats, certainly. The Soviets rebuilt after the catastrophic losses of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, but that recovery took months, consumed enormous reserves of manpower, and cost millions of lives before the Moscow counteroffensive in December. The British transformation from the humiliation of Dunkirk in May 1940 to the victory at El Alamein in October 1942 took over 2 years and required the replacement of an entire generation of senior commanders. Even the Germans, who had built perhaps the finest tactical army in modern history, took 4 months to regenerate enough combat power after the Normandy breakout to launch the Ardennes offensive in December 1944. The American recovery from Kasserine to El Guettar took 39 days. And the men doing the fighting were, for the most part, the same men who had been defeated 5 weeks earlier. The officers who fought through this transformation went on to shape the rest of the war. Patton returned to Morocco in mid-April to plan the invasion of Sicily, where he would command the 7th Army. Before he left, he made one final command decision that illustrated both his ruthlessness and the unforgiving nature of the reforms he had imposed. In early April, Patton relieved Orlando Ward from command of the 1st Armoured Division after the fighting at Magnesy, where Ward had personally led an infantry attack, been wounded by a machine gun bullet in the eye, and earned the Distinguished Service Cross. Ward's relief was not for cowardice. It was for what Patton perceived as excessive caution in committing his armour. Major General Ernest Harmon, the aggressive tank commander who had stabilized the Kasserine line in February, took over the 1st Armoured Division. The message to every officer in 2nd Corps was unmistakable. Performance was the only currency that mattered. Rank and reputation offered no protection. Bradley succeeded Patton as 2nd Corps commander and led the final offensive in northern Tunisia. The campaign ended on May 13, 1943, with the surrender of over 260,000 Axis troops, including the entire 1st Italian Army. It was the largest Axis surrender of the war to that point, exceeding even Stalingrad in the number of prisoners taken. Messe, who had been promoted to Marshal of Italy just one day before the surrender, gave himself up to the British at Enfidaville. He had fought a capable defensive campaign with inadequate resources, and his post-war memoir would be marked more by professional analysis than by bitterness. Terry Allen and Theodore Roosevelt Jr. led the Big Red One ashore at Gila during the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, where their hardened veterans repulsed an armoured counterattack by the Hermann Göring Division on the beaches. Bradley later wrote that only the perverse Big Red One, with its no less perverse commander, was both hard and experienced enough to take that assault in stride. The division that had been forged at El Guettar performed exactly as its training had prepared it. Roosevelt would go on to land with the first wave at Utah Beach on D-Day, June 6, 1944, the oldest man and only general to wade ashore with the assault troops. At 56 years old, still walking with his cane, still leading from the front as he had done in Tunisia, he received the Medal of Honor for his actions that day. He died of a heart attack 1 month later in Normandy. He is buried at the Normandy American Cemetery alongside his brother Quentin, who had been killed as a pilot in the First World War. Ward, despite his relief, went on to command the 20th Armoured Division in the final campaign in Germany in 1945. After the war, he served as the Army's Chief of Military History, overseeing the official histories of the conflict, including the very volumes that documented the lessons of Kasserine and the failures of command that had led to his own men being destroyed at Sidi Bou Zid. It was a fitting irony that the general who had been overruled by Fredendall would later supervise the historical record that proved he had been right all along. Fredendall was sent home quietly. Eisenhower handled the relief as a routine reassignment to protect Fredendall's reputation, a decision he later regretted. Afraid he might be shot down by the Germans if he flew to Algeria, Fredendall rode away from the front in a Buick sedan before boarding a plane for the United States. He was promoted to lieutenant general and given command of the Second Army, a training organization back home. He was welcomed home as a hero by a public that knew nothing of the circumstances of his removal. He retired in 1946 and died in 1963 at the age of 79, largely forgotten by a nation that remembered Patton, Bradley, and Eisenhower, but not the general whose failures had made their reputations necessary. The lessons of Kasserine and El Guettar were woven directly into every American operation that followed. The combat command system in armored divisions was preserved, but the suicidal practice of scattering them in penny packets was permanently forbidden. Air-ground coordination was institutionalized, with forward air controllers assigned to ground units. Tank-destroyer doctrine was refined based on the performance of the 601st and 899th Battalions at El Guettar. The M3 gun motor carriage was phased out in favor of the more capable M10. The replacement system was reformed. Artillery, fire control procedures that had proven so devastating at El Guettar became standard across the army. The American army that landed at Salerno, at Anzio, at Normandy, and in southern France was, in the most fundamental institutional sense, the army that had been forged in those 39 days between Kasserine and El Guettar. Today, the men who fought and died in Tunisia are remembered at the North Africa American Cemetery near Carthage, on the outskirts of the Tunisian capital. The cemetery covers 27 acres on a hillside overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. 2,841 white marble headstones stand in precise rows across manicured grounds, shaded by cypress and olive trees. On the wall of the missing, 3,724 names are inscribed, men whose remains were never recovered from the deserts, mountains, and coastal waters of North Africa. The Tunisian government granted the land for free use in perpetuity, a gesture of enduring respect. The cemetery was dedicated in 1960 and is maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission. It is the only American military cemetery on the African continent. Among those buried there is Private Nicholas Miniu, a Polish-born American soldier who earned the Medal of Honor for his actions near Medjez El Bab in April 1943, the only Medal of Honor recipient interred at the cemetery. Also resting there is Captain Foy Draper, who had won a gold medal as a sprinter at the 1936 Berlin Olympics, running on the 4x100-meter relay team before serving and dying as a pilot over Tunisia. Their graves stand alongside those of thousands of other young Americans, most of whom have no famous stories, no medals, no records beyond a white cross and a name carved in marble. At Kasserine Pass itself, A stone memorial stands off the highway, a half-mile west of the city of Kasserine. The monument was restored with funding from the United States Ambassador's Fund for Cultural Preservation. The United States Ambassador to Tunisia has laid wreaths at the site to honor the anniversary of the battle. American ambassadors visit the site regularly, a small but meaningful tradition of remembrance in a country where the scars of that winter's fighting have long since faded from the landscape. The pass looks much as it did in 1943, a wide gap in the mountains, the road running through it, the hills where the Bersaglieri charged and where American engineers fought and died rising on either side. Wildflowers grow now where tanks once burned. The story of Kasserine and El Guettar is not simply a story of defeat and recovery. It is a story about what separates armies that learn from armies that do not. The German and Italian commanders who dismissed the Americans after Kasserine made a mistake that goes beyond battlefield arrogance. They assumed that the army they had beaten would remain the army they had beaten. They judged American soldiers by their worst day and were blindsided when those same soldiers fought at their best just 5 weeks later. The men of Second Corps did not transform because they were given better weapons, though some improved equipment did arrive. They did not transform because they were replaced by different soldiers. The riflemen who crouched in their foxholes at El Guettar on March 23rd were largely the same men who had retreated through Kasserine Pass on February 20th. What changed was leadership. What changed was accountability. What changed was the willingness of an institution to look at its own failure without flinching and fix what was broken, even if that meant ending the careers of generals who had been called the best in the army just months before. 768 men from the Kasserine fighting never came home. Hundreds more fell at El Guettar, and in the weeks of combat that followed. They were farm boys from Iowa, and factory workers from Detroit, and college students from New England. They were the sons and brothers and fathers of a nation that had sent them across an ocean to fight in a desert most of them had never heard of before the war. Some of them died in defeat at Kasserine. Others died in victory at El Guettar. All of them deserved to be remembered. The Axis commanders who underestimated them learned a lesson that would be repeated across Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany for the next 2 years. The American army was not perfect. It made mistakes, sometimes terrible ones, but it learned from those mistakes faster than any army in modern history. And once it learned, it did not forget. That is the true legacy of those 39 days in Tunisia. Not that America's army was beaten, but that it refused to stay beaten. And the Italian and German officers who had written off those retreating soldiers as amateurs were left to face the consequences of that misjudgment for the rest of the war.